There were many in the 1800s who wouldn't have been surprised at scenes of barbarism on America's frontiers. This was thought to be quite literally a new world, with all the wanton recklessness or utopian promise of youth. Some were sure that the boundless wilderness would cause inevitable degeneration. Civilization would lapse into barbarism here. Yet others felt that the New World offered one last chance to build society anew, free of the tyranny, poverty, and injustice that plagued the old. No doubt the Mormons harbored such fears and hopes for their own new land as the river ice began to break and new grasses pushed through the sod of western prairies that spring of 1847. Perhaps 8,000 or 9,000 of them occupied hastily thrown-up log cabins on both sides of the Missouri near present-day Omaha. On the Nebraska side was winter quarters. On the Iowa side, Canesville. Some had wintered in towns downriver, St. Louis or St. Joseph. Many remained in Nauvoo or in major East Coast cities. Several thousand were in England, awaiting word as to where the camp of Israel would settle so they might join them. Several hundred miles west of winter quarters near Pueblo, Colorado, Mormon converts from Mississippi and Sikh detachments from the Mormon Battalion made up a community of nearly 300. Still further west, the remainder of the battalion, 350 strong, had reached San Diego and Los Angeles. Sam Brannan's group was in Northern California. This party of 238 had sailed round the Horn the previous year in the ship Brooklyn. A few others had come to California with earlier overland migrations. Thus, tens of thousands were responding to Apostle Orson Pratt's earlier clarion call.
We do not want one saint to be left in the United States. Let every branch in the east, west, north, and the south be determined to flee out of Babylon, either by land or by sea.
All that winter they made preparations for the pioneer journey. In January, Brigham Young announced that they would travel in groups of 10, 50, and 100 wagons, with a captain presiding over each group. He urged the companies to divide the poor among them so that no one group would bear an undue burden. He encouraged his followers with a revelation in which divine assurance was given that they would be led by that God who led the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, and his arm is stretched out in the last days to save his people, Israel. But in their typically practical fashion, the Mormons didn't rely upon God's arm alone. They gathered together all of the scientific instruments they could find: sextants, barometers, thermometers, and telescopes. They consulted travelers visiting their camp from the West, including the Catholic missionary Father De Smet. They prepared maps of the West based on this one published by John C. Fremont in 1845. Seeds, plows, saws, and other equipment essential to new settlement were gathered. They carried with them a large leather boat equipped with nets and other fishing gear. They took pains to assure the participation of men skilled in a variety of needed crafts and trades. They even conducted lectures on the methods of irrigation should they find the rainfall insufficient for raising crops. Thus prepared, a select pioneer company, 148 strong, began in early April to gather a short distance west of winter quarters. This was a crack team, mainly tried and experienced men, commissioned to mark the trail, choose a settlement site, and begin construction of shelters for companies to follow. On April 16th, they began their journey in earnest. Brigham Young presided over the expedition, overseeing every detail. Under his rule, a bugle sounded at 5 o'clock in the morning. The whole company was to breakfast, harness their teams, and be prepared for travel by 7. They were to be on the road until 8:30 in the evening and be ready for bed by 9. Young offered continuous advice and occasional reprimands when evening and Sunday recreation became too rowdy. It was a bracing regimen that paid off in rapid travel. A makeshift odometer, somewhat like this one, automatically ticked off the revolutions of a wagon wheel as they moved up the valley of the Platte. By its measurements, 15 to 20-mile days were not uncommon. In 39 travel days, the company arrived at Fort Laramie, averaging 14 miles a day for the 600-mile leg of the journey. To avoid possible conflicts, they had established the Mormon Trail on the north side of the river, away from the main road on the south side. This first half of their journey had been easy going. The mountains and deserts of the second half would be a greater challenge. After crossing near Fort Laramie to the south side of the Platte, the company paused to shoe animals, repair wagons, and freshen up for the next leg of their journey. Here they met an advance contingent of Mississippi and ailing Mormon battalion saints. From them they learned that an enormous Oregon-bound migration of at least 2,000 wagons was behind them on the trail. From this point, they were back on the regular immigrant road, following the Platte to its crossing near the mouth of the Sweetwater. After Fort Laramie, a crew was assigned to prepare and plant markers, each 10 miles along the way. Others were to gather food for the expedition. Young sharply rebuked the hunters on at least one occasion for being wasteful of flesh, killing more than was really needed. At the last crossing of the Platte, before striking the Sweetwater, they unloaded their leather boat. They used it to ferry themselves and other westward-bound immigrants across the swollen waters. Ever pressed for hard cash, they were delighted to learn that the Oregon-bound immigrants were willing to pay $1.50 to $2 a wagon for the ferry service. A crew was given the task of building a raft that could carry a loaded wagon across the river. 10 men under Thomas Grover were left at the ferry to man the operation. They then climbed up over South Pass. Along the Big and Little Sandy rivers, they ran into several parties of travelers, including mountain men Moses Harris, Miles Goodyear, and Jim Bridger. Bridger recommended the Utah Valley as a settlement site. Harris, Cache Valley. Both had doubts about the enterprise, though Miles Goodyear was much more optimistic. Harris thought that there wouldn't be enough timber. Bridger feared that the growing season would be too short. But apparently the overall communication to the Pioneer Company was positive. It may have been these discussions which led Brigham Young finally to decide that the Mormons should settle in the vicinity of the Great Salt Lake. The only dissenting voice came from a fellow saint, Samuel Brannan. Brannan, with but 2 companions, had made a daring spring crossing of the Sierras, noting the grim remains of the Donner tragedy as they passed. He then hurried up the Humboldt, north to Fort Hall, and east to the Green, where he met Brigham Young's Pioneer Company in late June. Brannan had already set up a press in California, bringing with him 16 issues of his California Star. He also brought the news that California had been occupied by the United States and would most certainly become a U.S. possession. His settlement on the San Joaquin River had been established, and the saints there were making plans to receive the main companies when they arrived. Come on to California, he urged, where the climate is mild, the soil proven fertile, and where thousands of acres of well-watered land can be had for the taking. Young pondered Brannan's enthusiastic advice. California, even then, was a magic word, stirring up images of physical comfort, a bounteous nature, and the good life. Vast tracts of that rich land could fall under Mormon control if Brigham Young would only give the word. But such a land would surely attract thousands from the states, inundating the Mormons in a flood of new settlers. It may well be that at that moment the fate of the Mormon movement hung in the balance. Apparently, without further discussion, Young rejected Brannan's advice. The company, now joined by the lead parties of the Pueblo Battalion Group, moved on to Fort Bridger.
The fort,
Orson Pratt wrote with obvious disappointment,
consists of 2 adjoining log houses, dirt roofs, and a small picket yard of logs set in the ground.
From there they left the Oregon Trail, continuing on over Hastings Cutoff, on a route that Pratt wrote,
is but dimly seen, as only a few wagons passed over it last season.
As they moved down Echo Canyon, the company spread out along the trail, partly due to an outbreak of an unknown disease they called mountain fever, maybe a variant of Rocky Mountain spotted fever that's carried by wood ticks. After emerging from the canyon, a scouting party under Orson Pratt considered the Weber Canyon route to the valleys, which had been used by most of the 1846 parties. However, a 5-mile ride down the canyon convinced him that they should return and search for the Donner Reed tracks. They shortly found them, partially overgrown with grass, and began to improve the road their predecessors of the previous season had blazed. Continuing to work the road as they moved, Pratt's party gained glimpses of the Salt Lake Valley from the top of Big Mountain on July 19th. On the 21st, he and Erastus Snow descended Emigration Canyon, climbed over Donner Hill, and gazed in awe upon the panorama spread out below them.
Beholding in a moment such an extensive scenery open before us, we could not refrain from a shout of joy, which almost involuntarily escaped from our lips the moment this grand and lovely scenery was within our view.
After a brief exploration, the men returned to their camp. The next day, July 22nd, Pratt guided the first wagons to the mouth of Emigration Canyon, where they worked 4 hours clearing a path to avoid the steep hill the Donner Party had taken. They then rolled into the Salt Lake Valley and camped in the vicinity of 5th East and 19th South. The next morning, they moved north to about 4th South and Main, about where the Center Theater was built, and began plowing. That evening, Pratt dedicated the land as a home for the Saints. Two days later, the last wagons pulled out of Emigration Canyon. Brigham Young, recovering from a severe bout with Rocky Mountain fever, had his driver stop the carriage. He gazed upon the scene. As he did so, he recalled later,
"That darkness which had rested over every place where we'd been in the States vanished altogether, and I felt assured that our enemies would never accomplish anything more towards our destruction than what they had accomplished."
Wilford Woodruff later remembered that Young was wrapped in vision for a few moments, then said, "It is enough. This is the right place. Drive on." In his diary entry that day, however, Young wrote only the following.
"I started early this morning, and after crossing Emigration Canyon Creek 18 times, emerged from the canyon and camped with the main body at 2 p.m. About noon, the 5-acre potato patch was plowed. Then the brethren commenced planting their seed potatoes. At 5, a light shower accompanied by thunder and a stiff breeze.
They had accomplished the journey with little privation and no loss of life. The real suffering had been at winter quarters. Having found a suitable place to settle, this advance company began immediately a communal effort to prepare for those behind them on the trail. July 25th was a Sunday, and so, of course, was devoted to sermons and speeches. But during the rest of the week, crews were assigned to carry out the various necessary immediate tasks. Plowing and planting was continued. Young appointed surveyors, fence builders, and sawyers. They built a bowery to provide shelter when public meetings were held. One crew was assigned on July 27th to search the canyons of the Wasatch Mountains for timber. Another crew explored westward to the Oquirrhs. Brigham Young led a party northward. After noting the warm springs at the northern end of the Salt Lake Valley, Young's party decided to climb the foothills so they might gain a better view of the landscape. They headed for a peculiarly rounded knob which stood out clearly from the rest. From its summit, they could see the Jordan River from its narrows near point of the mountain to where it emptied into the lake. They also noted the courses of several other streams which crossed the valley from the east to flow into the Jordan. Completing their bird's-eye survey, one of the party commented that this would be an ideal place to raise a flag or ensign. Brigham Young agreed and noted in his diary that night,
"I ascended a hill north of the city site, which I named Ensign Peak."
They had no flag with them on their hike that day, and had they raised one, I doubt very much that it would have been the Stars and Stripes. The fact is that the Mormons were in a very resentful mood about their treatment at the hands of government officials. At the moment, they felt no great loyalty to the United States. The flag they might have raised, had they had one, would probably have looked very much like this. This was a banner that church leaders ordered to be made representing the flags of all nations. Mormons believed it fulfilled an Isaiah prophecy that in the last days an ensign or flag would be raised up that would transcend national loyalties and attract all peoples. It was to be, in fact, the flag of the Mormon Kingdom of God. Ensign Peak thus became a symbol of international outreach. It's now obscured from much of the downtown area by a condominium complex. However, the widespread wish to be separated from the United States had a broader and more positive dimension. 2 weeks after the Pioneer Company entered the Salt Lake Valley, Brigham Young ordered that a dam be built across one of the creeks to form a pool. He then was immersed in a ritual rebaptism. Each of the apostles present then followed, and then most of the rest of the company. It was a solemn but joyous occasion. Erastus Snow wrote of it, "We had, as it were, entered a new land and wished to renew our covenants and commence a newness of life." The use of the word new 3 times in that short context was profoundly significant. For rebaptism represented on that occasion much more than just a call to repentance. It was, as Snow clearly stated, a recognition that in a new land it may be possible to begin society anew, to reshape society, rooting out all that is unjust and undesirable in the old. From the earliest settlement, the thought of a new land, of a new world, had awakened the reformist impulse in man. This wish to build a better world made the isolation of the Great Basin, which others had feared, a great attraction to the Mormons. Whereas the doughty Swiss immigrant Heinrich Lienhard would gladly have stayed here in 1846 had there been earlier settlers, the Mormons gladly stayed in 1847 because there were no earlier settlers. They were as many travel days away from the nearest established settlement as were the Pilgrims from London in the 1600s. And in their present mood, they wanted nothing so much as to be left alone. Not even the streams and rivers here mingled with those on the outside, which suited the Mormons just fine. But they were soon to find that isolation a mixed blessing. While it was no doubt comforting that there were none here to hurt or make afraid, as their hymn expressed it, there were likewise none to assist or supply in case of need. Previous pioneering in remote frontiers had often been attended by terrible privation and loss of life. There inevitably followed a long, costly period of dependency on the mother society. This land was unknown and her soils untried. No one knew for sure whether large numbers could survive here. There were, however, positive factors favoring the Mormon enterprise. Visitors from the time of the Dominguez Escalante expedition had considered the bench and valley lands excellent for grazing. Fremont agreed, suggesting that wheat and other grains could be raised there as well. Late in 1846, Miles Goodyear had established a trading post, or at least a cabin, on the site of present-day Ogden. By summer, he had corn and other vegetable crops well underway. Of all the mountain men the Mormons had met on the trail, he was the most positive, though there may have been some self-interest in his assessment. The migration he had hoped to serve from his base at the mouth of the Weber River obviously wasn't going to materialize as he had planned. The Mormons themselves were for the most part favorably impressed by the new home site, though their trek across western Wyoming would likely have made the most withered of grasses look lush. Woodruff called the Salt Lake region
a vast, rich, fertile valley, clothed with the heaviest garb of green, abounding with the best freshwater springs, riverlets, creeks, brooks, and rivers of varied sizes.
Orson Pratt noticed, however,
the grass had nearly dried up for want of moisture. The drier places were swarming with very large crickets, about the size of a man's thumb.
Nonetheless, Pratt and others were pleased with the site, if less enthusiastic than Woodruff. Time would show that irrigation was vital to successful agriculture in the Great Basin. In this respect, the Mormon choice for an initial settlement site was extremely fortunate. The Salt Lake Valley was crossed from east to west by 7 small streams, which were fed most of the summer by snows melting from the Wasatch Mountains. A small brush diversion dam would in most instances be sufficient to feed a canal the 2 or 3 miles needed before lands could be irrigated from the next stream. This was of vital importance, as the Mormons had almost no capital and needed to put land into immediate production. There were few places in the arid West where this could be done as expeditiously as in the Salt Lake Valley. They were fortunate for another reason as well. Many areas of the Great Basin were the regular habitat of Indians. There were northern Shoshone to the north, Goshutes and western Shoshone to the west, Utes to the south, and Paiutes to the southwest. The Great Salt Lake Valley, however, had for some time been a sort of buffer zone between the various tribes. There were no Indian villages near the initial settlement site, and the Mormons were not yet encroaching on territorial claims of any particular group. When they looked beyond the Salt Lake Valley, however, they intruded upon established territory in almost any direction. Their good fortune was that the full implications of their settlement in the Great Basin didn't occur to the native leaders until the Mormons were present in numbers sufficient to withstand Indian resistance. The final favorable circumstance came from their own group character and their experiences as a people over the previous 17 years. Had each gone out to settle his own farm or gone prospecting, or had many been enticed by California, the Mormon story would have been greatly altered. But the saints by this time were instinctively obedient to those they saw as their legitimate authorities. Oh, sure, they grumbled and some dissented, but most eventually moved in directions urged by their leaders. It would have made more sense, been more rational from one point of view, had they set about immediately building their own homes for their wives and families, rather than helping to build a community bowery or plowing in a common field. But to do so would have been repugnant to Mormon notions of authority, unity, and order. Thus, the principles which were to shape Mormon use of this land were worlds away from the more highly individualistic approach common to other Western settlements. Brigham Young enunciated the basic philosophy of Mormon settlement in the Great Basin in his sermon on July the 25th.
No man should buy or sell land. Every man should have his land measured off to him for city and farming purposes, what he could till. He might till it as he pleased, but he should be industrious and take care of it. There should be no private ownership of streams, wood, or timber, and only dead timber should be used as fuel.
Working under these rules, they put a whipsaw into operation, set up a blacksmith shop, built a boat, hewed out a canyon road, and established an adobe yard. They laid out the city in 10-acre blocks, constructed a fort with adobe walls on 3 sides, and harvested salt from the lake. By December 7th, they had planted 2,000 acres of fall wheat. Certainly, they had work aplenty to do. Hard on the heels of the Pioneer Company were the sick detachments of the Battalion and the Mississippi Saints. Behind them were 4 more companies of immigrants numbering 1,500 souls. Before winter set in, the first of the discharged battalion members would arrive from California. With the initial labors well underway, Brigham Young turned the reins of government over to a high council of 12 men under Joseph Smith's uncle, John Smith. He then returned with a substantial company to winter quarters. From there, letters would be sent to the scattered saints throughout the world, proclaiming that a settlement place had been found. The saints were urged to come at the first opportunity to the Valley, as it was already being called. In 1847, this was still a raw, unsettled wilderness. But latter-day Israel was soon to be gathered to this newfound land. Here they would throw their collective energies into the task of building up the Mormon Zion.